Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka. Today we have a special episode featuring ISI's own Dan McCarthy. Dan is the editor of Modern Age and the vice president of the Collegiate Network Journalism Program. We recently had Dan address the ISI team on the history of the conservative intellectual movement and the strains of thought shaping debate and discussion on the right today. We're happy to give you a behind-the-scenes access to his lecture and let you in on how ISI is thinking about the influences that shape our student programming. Before we get started, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in fulfilling that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Dan, take it away.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
When discussing the history of conservatism, there's always a choice to be made as to where to begin. Conservatism is attempting to conserve, among many other things, our religious traditions, the philosophical tradition, and the political and civilizational inheritance of classical civilization. We also have, of course, a great inheritance from the Middle Ages. And our own country, the United States, is an outstanding example of action and ideas coming together and producing remarkable results. So one can start almost at any one of those points. In the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, perhaps looking first at England before we move over to the United States. And then in talking about the United States, there's, of course, a great deal of ground to cover. We have over 200 years of history as an independent nation, and within that time, there have been many varieties of conservatism that have sprung up, flourished, in some cases clashed with one another, and in some cases, they have continued to be of great salience in today's world. In others, however, they have somewhat drifted off the radar, which does not mean necessarily that they are gone forever. What we've seen in the history of conservatism in the United States is that oftentimes what seems to be a losing side winds up winning in the end, or making a comeback when you least expect it. Whereas ideas that seem dominant, both on the right or perhaps in American intellectual life as a whole, sometimes prove to be remarkably vulnerable to attack, to revolution, to change, and to being overcome by the force of events and the force of new ideas, perhaps a more provocative, insurgent intellectual movement that tries to throw out something that had been successful before. So I could begin by telling you about the exclusion crisis in late 17th century England, which is where we get the terms Whig and Tory. We could go a little further back in British history and talk about the English Civil War, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. But I think the best place to begin today is with the American Revolution itself. And the American Revolution is a topic of contention among conservatives. And today there is a tendency for many conservatives, and in fact, many Americans of all political stripes, to think of the American Revolution primarily in intellectual terms, to think that one day George Washington or perhaps Thomas Jefferson was sleeping on his couch on his plantation, and then he woke up and started reading a little bit from the collected works of John Locke, and suddenly Thomas Jefferson decided, aha, well, human beings are all naturally equal. They have natural rights, and therefore we ought to have a revolution, overthrow a king, establish a republic, and be an independent country. There's this tendency to think that the American Revolution was driven, first of all, by an abstract principle. You often hear politicians even today talk about the notion that America is an idea rather than a traditional kind of country, a traditional place and a people, which is what we would normally think of a nation as being. Well, I don't want to say that there is absolutely no importance in the ideas that animate the American Revolution and in our political tradition as a whole. But there is a marked tendency right now to go too far in the direction of thinking that America is simply an Enlightenment project, that it is sprung fully formed from the head of John Locke, as if from the head of Zeus were springing Athena or something like that. The American Revolution actually gets started in a very ragged and unpredictable way. So what's happening? you have Americans who live within these English colonies, these British colonies in the New World, and they have a high degree of self-government. It's something that's become a way of life for them over the course of decades and indeed centuries. They also have a very strong sense of themselves as Englishmen, which means being a subject of the King of England, but it also means having the kinds of rights and legal privileges that English subjects enjoy, such as a right to a trial by a jury of your peers. Some of these positive rights go back all the way to Magna Carta. So Americans were very concerned about natural rights that they might find in philosophers like John Locke, but they also had this sense of very concrete inherited rights that they as Americans enjoyed because they were an offshoot of the English people and because they were subjects of the King of England. Well, the American colonies were growing very rapidly, and this posed a certain problem of governance because the King of England and Parliament across the Atlantic Ocean had a very difficult time controlling what was happening in the American colonies. The American colonies were expanding in terms of population. They were expanding in terms of their geographic footprint. You had commerce really flourishing in the colonies, and the colonists were willing to engage in trade with almost anyone. That included with the Indians. During the French and Indian War, about a decade before the American Revolutionary War, some of the American colonists were willing to trade even with the French enemy, while they were still part of the British Empire. So America was a land that was already very entrepreneurial. It was engaged in a great deal of commerce, a great deal of trade. And the British looked at this and they said, well, we should get our share of that revenue. We should tax the American colonies, especially if we have to fight wars for the defense of the American colonies. So the American colonies should pay more taxes. We also want to regulate the trade of the American colonies. The American colonies should not be looking out for their own interest in terms of industrial development and in terms of commerce. Instead, the American colonies should be serving the British motherland. They should be serving the empire as a whole. So the British were imposing a number of trade restrictions, regulations, and taxes on the American colonies. What this produced was a high degree of smuggling and tax evasion among the American colonists. Well, that's to be expected. You see tax evasion and smuggling anytime you have a high degree of taxes and anytime you have restrictions upon trade. So the Americans were breaking the British law. The Parliament was not happy with this, and Parliament insisted that these Americans who break the law should be put on trial. However, there was another problem here. When you put American smugglers and American tax evaders on trial in front of American juries, what happened? American juries wound up siding with the tax evaders and the smugglers rather than with the British authorities. And the American legislatures also get involved here. They say, well, what's going on is you are imposing, sort of too many taxes and too many controls on the colonies. We, the legislatures, the representatives of the American people here in North America itself, we should be the ones who are in charge of questions of trade and questions of taxation. And this doesn't mean that we don't want to be part of the British Empire. It doesn't mean we don't still love the King of England. But it does mean that Parliament doesn't really have authority to be taxing us and to be regulating us. Now, keep in mind what is the governing political philosophy in England at the time. For reasons that are a little too complex to go into today, England was in the midst of a supremacy of the Whig Party. The Whig Party's theory of government was basically that government rests upon the consent of the governed, and that taxation in particular was something to which the people's representatives had to give their consent. And if that didn't happen, then you probably had a tyrannical situation. These ideas are certainly found expressed in John Locke's second treatise. But they're not just Lockean ideas. In fact, the idea that government does fundamentally rest on the consent of the people and is for the good of the people is an idea that has precedence in the classical world, it has precedence in Thomas Aquinas, and throughout Western civilization. John Locke offered a variation on this, and one that was, very much keyed towards British conditions in the 17th and 18th centuries, and one that was very supportive of Parliament and supportive of the idea of greater commerce. But it's not correct to think that John Locke simply created the idea of government by consent by himself. In fact, this was a tradition in Western civilization that had, in various forms, a history stretching back thousands of years. The Whigs in England said that government was based on the consent of the governed, and that taxation required the consent of Parliament. But you can see an obvious problem here. The American colonists did not have representation in Parliament. They didn't elect members of Parliament. They did elect, in many cases, members of their own state or rather colonial legislatures. But those colonial legislatures were being overridden by the king and overridden by Parliament. The question was, where did Parliament get the authority to be telling the Americans what their tax rates would be, what their trade policies would be? And then, where did Parliament get the authority to punish Americans who decided they didn't like what Parliament was telling them these rules would be? What winds up happening is that, not only are Americans evading taxes and smuggling, then being put on trial, the British decide that because American juries will not convict Americans who are being put on trial, they will instead try them in other kinds of circumstances. So one thing the British do is they put Americans on trial before admiralty courts, basically like a military tribunal today. They also start to say, well, maybe we need to ship the Americans who we accuse of crimes back to England for trial. These are violations of basic, traditional English rights going back to Magna Carta, and basically that Englishmen in England itself took for granted, and that the Americans thought really have to apply to America as well. Otherwise, you have a tyrannical situation. You have a situation in which Parliament has unchecked power, and you have no representatives there to speak up for yourself, and the king is simply going along with Parliament. The Americans really maintained a certain degree of affection for the king until very late in the day. It was Parliament that they had the primary problem with at the outset. The colonial legislatures say that, we should be representing the American people. We should be the ones deciding about taxation and regulation. And Parliament is not hearing this. Parliament, is very much jealous of its own power. And so Parliament, even though it has some wise statesmen who do decide, well, we're going to lower American taxes because they're very unhappy and they're starting to rebel. We're going to, ease up on some of these trade restrictions. We're going to, give the Americans a fair shake. But throughout all of this, Parliament always insists that it has the right to rule the American colonies directly and that it does not have to pay attention to the colonial legislatures. This becomes a fundamental bone of contention. And it goes against the very philosophy that the British themselves had embraced, right? So if the whole sense of legitimacy in the British government was based upon the idea of the consent of the governed, based upon the idea that Parliament was a representative institution, then clearly people who are excluded from this deal will start to wonder, well, then why are we considered to be subjects of the British? And why are we considered to be, under their authority when it comes to all of these laws that are very difficult on us? There is an escalating series of tensions and conflicts. You have things like the Boston Tea Party, for example. One problem that the British encounter is that not only do you now have the colonists rejecting British authority, but the colonists are in many cases just as well armed as British soldiers are. So what happens next? The British decide, well, we're going to have to confiscate some of the armories that the Americans have. We're going to have to take their guns away. So the British, tried to do this in Lexington and Concord, and that leads to a clash between British soldiers and American militia forces that are going to refuse to be disarmed and are going to protect American armories. That's how the American Revolution gets started. Now, it's not to say that there weren't important ideas in circulation, both in England and in America, about natural rights and about, the natural equality of human beings, and the idea that even a monarch exists because the people have in some way consented to create a monarchy in their country. These ideas certainly were current both in America and in Britain. But you had a number of very concrete issues between the British and the Americans that were leading directly to eventually armed conflicts between American militias and the British, and leading basically, the British start to crack down on the American colonial legislatures, and because the colonial legislatures become tools of Parliament, or because colonial governors are being appointed by the king and therefore become the king's minions, you have Americans start to create committees of correspondence, and eventually they just create, basically informal, extra-constitutional governments of their own, and these become the leading forces of the American Revolution. The Americans are still, however, very reluctant to declare independence from Britain. They still like the idea of monarchy. Britain is a very successful country in the 18th century. In fact, probably the most successful and prosperous, large country in the world. And the Americans think that it has a wonderful form of government. Why would they want to leave something as successful as the British Empire? And yet, as they see that violence is now spiraling out of control between British forces and American rebels, something is going to have to be done. Either the British are going to have to concede that the Americans do indeed have the right to self-government in their own legislatures, or the Americans are going to have to declare independence. And so a number of American leaders, they recognize that they have a choice right now between either a prolonged guerrilla war with no particular sort of official leadership, and this could lead, to all sorts of chaos over time. It could either, be defeated by the British, in which case, the British would be expected to be vengeful, and they would not only reimpose all the restrictions Americans disliked, but they would bring in new things as well, and they would certainly disarm the Americans. Or if a very disorganized guerrilla war succeeded, you might very well have a chaotic situation, even if the British were defeated, a situation in which there was no orderly government. So the Declaration of Independence and the fact that America's Continental Congress declares independence is based on the idea that you need to have responsible leadership for this revolution that is already happening. And when you have responsible leadership for this revolution, you have to have a justification for the revolution. It should be a legal justification, it should be a practical justification, and it should also be a philosophical justification. And already a number of Americans, such as Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams and John Adams, they had all been making very strong arguments, making the case for natural rights, making the case for human equality, making the case for, in some cases, if not a republican form of government, certainly a form of government in which the monarch is very respectful of the legislature. And so these ideas were already in very wide circulation when Thomas Jefferson was tasked with writing the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson does that. Now, Jefferson himself is, in many respects, intellectually speaking, among the more progressive and enlightened of Americans. He is someone who really does like reading, French philosophy. He's someone who is very much devoted to John Locke. He's very much devoted to the scientific thinker Francis Bacon and to a number of other quite, sort of advanced and what might even be called, in a loose sense, liberal thinkers of his time. So Jefferson certainly has those elements. But it's not as if, again, that Jefferson or those elements are dictating the course of the American Revolution. Quite the contrary. It's rather the case that the American colonists are using what are considered the most up-to-date arguments in favor of their cause. And ultimately that becomes a cause of independence. And these up-to-date arguments, draw upon John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, although they also, in various ways draw upon Aristotle, they draw upon Christian tradition as well. Especially you have to remember, the churches during the revolutionary period are often scenes where, from the pulpit, you're hearing these arguments against the British and arguments in favor of the Americans. So the American Revolution is a many-faceted thing. It is not simply an abstract product of Enlightenment thought. It's not simply the child of John Locke's philosophy. And it is something that gives rise to a new nation, which is a remarkable thing. In many respects, the American Revolution was actually quite conservative, right? Americans were fighting for traditional rights that they had enjoyed. They were fighting for their own local self-government, for their colonial legislatures. And in those respects, the American Revolution doesn't seem so revolutionary at all. It's rather kind of counter-revolutionary. It's an attempt to stop the British from centralizing power and imposing new rules using their military force, ultimately. However, there also is the fact that when you have a break between sort of one unit and another, an act that might be called secession, certainly an act of creating a new political unit that had not existed before. When you have a war that goes on for several years, as the American Revolutionary War does, you wind up with some transformative forces being unleashed within your country. So there is a sense in which the American Revolution is indeed really a revolution. It really is a break from the way that things have been before the revolutionary period. And so it's a mixture of things. There is both this revolutionary element, this transformative element in the American Revolution, and there's also this conservative element, this attachment to American roots, habits, and traditions, and American religion as well. It's a complex thing to get into. You have Catholics who support the American Revolution, but you also have a number of American revolutionaries who are Protestants who are very worried about the church structure that they're afraid the King of England might impose upon them. And they're looking at precedents in the King's newly acquired territories in Canada, particularly in Quebec. And they're saying, well, basically, if you have an established Catholic Church in Quebec Who knows what the king is going to do in England, or rather in America? The king might very well decide that he's going to establish an Anglican church, that he's going to crack down on Protestants who are not conforming to the Anglican church in America. And so there's a question of religious liberty that is very much animating certainly a lot of Protestants in America. But again, one should not overlook the Catholic support for the American Revolution as well. And Charles Carroll is one of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence. So why have we come to a point in America where people, especially conservatives nowadays, tend to think that the American Revolution was indeed just a purely Lockean phenomenon, something that was, sort of the direct descendant of this intellectual enlightenment of progressive thinkers who are often quite anti-Christian thinkers. Now, exactly what kind of religious commitments John Locke himself had is something that scholars continue to debate. It seems to me that the sort of consensus during Locke's own lifetime and in the century thereafter was that John Locke was at best a very unorthodox Christian. He was oftentimes called a Socinian. A Socinian is basically a non-Trinitarian. So a Socinian might very well believe in certain elements of the Bible, might believe in Jesus Christ, but does not accept the Trinity and may have various other quite heterodox views, and would, of course, be someone who probably doesn't want to be, subordinate to either an Anglican establishment or any other kind of Orthodox Christian religious establishment. That seems to have been where John Locke was coming from. But most Americans were, quite strong believers in the religions they already had, whether they were Catholic, whether they were Protestant. There are so many different varieties of Protestantism already flourishing in America in the early period that, one of the key questions that statesmen have to answer is how to make all these different elements work together, as opposed to being, sort of at one another's throats or in a sort of state of prolonged conflict. The U.S. Constitution is basically an attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, except unlike in the children's story, this time the Americans actually succeed. They do put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and the American Constitution, in some ways, is a restoration of the kind of orderly government that the Americans had enjoyed before the crisis began with the British government. Now, in the early 20th century, there was a school of thought among historians which tended to say that the U.S. Constitution, the creation of the constitutional order, was a reactionary tendency, that it was in fact a reaction against the American Revolution, that it was a counter-revolutionary tendency. The American Revolution, these historians would say, was all about sort of liberation, it was all about wild freedom, and then the U.S. Constitution was an attempt to reimpose central order and was therefore, deeply conservative. Now, subsequently, nowadays, there is a tendency to reject that view of earlier historians, and you often see historians now say, well, the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution are really of a piece, that they are, in fact, consistent with one another, and that there is a thread of Enlightenment thought running through both of these phenomena. I think there's actually a lot of truth, however, in the earlier estimation. And in fact, if you read the Founding Fathers, you read their correspondence, you can see, sort of arguments to be made on either side. But certainly the Founding Fathers, the framers of the Constitution, recognized that the British form of government had been very, very successful. It was something in many respects they wanted to emulate. It was something in some ways they even regretted no longer being part of. But they thought that they would have to create something on a Republican model that would nonetheless have the same kind of strengths that the British Constitution had. And you can see that, of course, in the U.S. Constitution, that it has a bicameral federal legislature, that it has this central federal government while also respecting the local governments of the states and of localities. And in general, it is a constitution that takes a great deal of inspiration from the British form. And in fact, during the ratification period, this was a bone of contention. Opponents of ratification of the U.S. Constitution said, wait a minute, this is kind of a backdoor to restore monarchy. This is all about, trying to undo the American Revolution. What did we fight this revolution for if all we were going to do is basically create this constitutional order that is in fact quite conservative? But the American people in the ratifying conventions, they prefer the Federalist case to the Anti-Federalist case, and so we have the U.S. Constitution. Now, you might be wondering, where does the idea that the American Revolution and the Constitution, they're just sort of forms of Enlightenment thought, and that they're a break with the tradition of the classical world and the Middle Ages, where does this come from? It basically is an idea that takes root in the interwar period of the 20th century, between World War I and World War II, and then it starts to sort of expand and become the consensus in the 1950s and beyond. And on the right, one of the most important thinkers in contributing to this is a man by the name of Leo Strauss. Now, Leo Strauss is an absolutely brilliant intellectual. He's born in Germany. He flees Nazism. He goes first to England and then eventually comes to America. Leo Strauss publishes in 1953 a classic book called Natural Right and History. And Leo Strauss is in some ways even more influential than other conservatives like, for example, Russell Kirk, who also has a major book published in 1953 called The Conservative Mind, or Robert Nisbet, who also has a 1953 book called The Quest for Community. Well, traditional conservatives have often looked to Russell Kirk and to Robert Nisbet and to Richard Weaver and others. Something that's unique about Leo Strauss is that he had graduate students. So Russell Kirk was very disillusioned by his experiences in American academia. He winds up leaving the academy and becoming an independent scholar. A number of other American traditionalists, they don't necessarily try to cultivate a school of thought among their students. And so, they certainly hope their students will take up their ideas, but it's not done in a very disciplined and coordinated way. With Leo Strauss, his graduate students do tend to have a very, very strong debt to him. And then the graduate students that those graduate students later teach when they become professors extend the influence even wider. This is why Leo Strauss is so important to the formation of the conservative intellectual movement, not just in the post-war era, but really through to today. And in fact, now in the 21st century, to the extent that there are any conservative political theory professors, political philosophy professors, government professors on campuses across America, oftentimes they are Straussians simply because that is the only sort of transmission belt for conservative ideas, broadly speaking, that you would have as, in graduate school. You might get them from a Straussian who got them from an earlier Straussian who got them from Leo Strauss himself. Leo Strauss is a very subtle thinker. I want to be careful not to tell you exactly how you should interpret him, because it's really something that you have to undertake for yourself. You have to read his works and decide, first of all, whether they're worth continuing to pursue, and second, if they are, then what Strauss is actually trying to say, because Strauss is often not obvious about things. But there is a sort of half-joking account that students of Leo Strauss often sort of share among themselves, that I'll share publicly with everyone here. It's called a trilemma. It's like a dilemma, only there are three choices instead of two. So people who read Leo Strauss, some of the students who first come to Strauss and start reading him, they notice that there are certain conclusions in Strauss's works, or certain intimations, rather. We shouldn't say they're explicit conclusions, but intimations that are somewhat in conflict with one another. So when you read Leo Strauss, you get the impression that modernity is bad. And in fact, Leo Strauss says pretty much explicitly that modernity begins with Niccolo Machiavelli, and modernity is always basically a form of Machiavellianism, a form of power politics, an attempt to dominate the natural world and reject, the sort of rule of nature itself. Machiavelli is the beginning of modernity. If you read Strauss's thoughts on Machiavelli, or if you read the work of Strauss, admirers like Harvey Mansfield, you'll see that they make a very strong and fascinating case for Machiavelli as someone who was centuries ahead of his time, and who really had, if not an understanding of, things like modern physics or modern biology, who certainly had an understanding of principles that would lead later on to the kinds of developments that we've seen in the natural sciences, and basically a profound break with Aristotelian thought, with the thought of the Stoics, the thought of medieval Christendom, etc. This is a totally revolutionary sort of intellectual act, first committed by Machiavelli and then later picked up by other Enlightenment thinkers. That's where Leo Strauss is coming from, and it's where Strauss's students are coming from. One of Strauss's most influential students was a fellow by the name of Harry Jaffa. Harry Jaffa was particularly concerned about the American context. And I'll say a little bit in a few minutes about the differences among various varieties of Straussians. Strauss was not alone in the 1950s in positing that there was an Enlightenment background for America. I should back up a little bit and just go into Strauss's trilemma, because I mentioned that, and I want to sort of flesh out the the three prongs of this trident. So you read Strauss's work, you come up with the impression that modernity is bad. It starts with Machiavelli. You also read Strauss's work, and you come up with the impression that America is good. Leo Strauss was tremendously grateful to America for not only being a harbor for him personally in the midst of the Nazi years, but for basically saving Western civilization from Nazism and continuing to stand up for Western civilization against Soviet tyranny. So modernity is bad, but America is good. The contradiction, however, the third prong of the trident, is America is modern. So how do you reconcile these 3 points? Well, you have to wind up, or at least, the natural thing to do is to reject one of them in order to reconcile the other 2, right? So the saying goes that if you take the view that modernity is bad and America is good, and then you want to modify that third Strauss premise, if you say that America is not modern, then you are a West Coast Straussian and a follower of Harry Jaffa. Harry Jaffa writes a great book called The Crisis of the House Divided. Harry Jaffa basically says that in some ways, Abraham Lincoln was a natural Platonist, and that he understood, in his debates, Abraham Lincoln was recapitulating certain Platonic arguments for truth. And so America is not fundamentally modern to the extent that Abraham Lincoln's an interpreter of America, and ultimately Jaffa even points back to the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson. He says all of this is really fundamentally Plato and Aristotle and not John Locke. Now, what if you reconcile the Straussian trilemma in the other way? What if you say modernity is bad, America is modern? The conclusion might be America's bad. This is, again, half humorously, but also semi-seriously, what people say East Coast Straussians believe. Some of the prominent names associated with East Coast Straussianism would include Alan Bloom and Harvey Mansfield. And Harvey Mansfield has this wonderful saying that the claim that all men are created equal is a noble half-truth. And I think that encapsulates East Coast Straussianism in a certain respect. So, as you know, there is this idea in Plato's Republic of the noble lie. Well, a noble half-truth sounds a bit like a noble lie, but is it? Is a half-truth, fundamentally an untruth? Is it fundamentally a truth, or is it really a kind of 50-50 mix? I won't go into great detail about the thought of Mansfield and Alan Bloom and of Harry Jaffa on the other side, but this is where you get a number of interpretations of America coming from these different schools of Straussian thought, and they have a very extended influence, especially among political theorists in the academy in the 20th century and beyond to this very day. There is a symposium in Harper's magazine about the nature of liberalism that's available right now, which includes perspectives from Francis Fukuyama, the author of The End of History, and Patrick Deneen, who, of course, is one of the great spokesmen for a kind of post-liberal conservatism. Fukuyama and Deneen, even though they have, in some ways, diametrically opposed views, both are, in an extended sense, Straussians. They certainly owe, and they would acknowledge, having an intellectual debt to the thought of Leo Strauss. Now, both of those men are Titanic thinkers, and by no means am I trying to sort of discard their ideas, in a sort of casual remark. But I will say that there are other ways of looking at America and the American tradition that are not Straussian and that don't get into some of the questions that arise when you think that either America is, modern and therefore bad, or that America, therefore can't be modern. So you see a thinker like Russell Kirk in a wonderful book such as The Roots of American Order, or in his 1953 masterpiece, The Conservative Mind. Russell Kirk is making an argument that, in fact, there is a kind of unbroken thread. There is a tradition of conservatism which unites early modern Britain and the United States. And it's not always the dominant tradition. You can certainly find that America may be drifting away from this tradition. As you might know, the original title for Russell Kirk's Conservative Mind was The Conservative Rout. It was about the defeat of conservatism. But even in defeat, conservatism survived, and there were still connections to be made between the conservatism of the 20th century and both in America and in the UK, and the earlier conservatism going back to Edmund Burke. And then from Burke, you find connections going back to the medieval world and the classical world as well. So one side of conservatism and its interpretation of America says that you can't make too much of the idea that modernity, especially in the American context, is a complete break with the past. There's a complete rejection of Christendom in the Middle Ages. There's a complete rejection of the classical tradition. In fact, someone like Russell Kirk would see a great deal of continuity and a great growth over time in conservative thought, in the sort of unfolding of divine providence, and of our understanding of this incredible patrimony that we have inherited from the ancients, from the medievals, and in fact, from our own forefathers as well. So you often see, even today, that there is a clash between some of these traditionalist conservative thinkers like Russell Kirk and his friend Mel Bradford, who was a professor at the University of Dallas, and some of their Straussian friends, because there's this fundamental question: is America fundamentally modern? Is it exclusively modern? Is it all just a sort of Lockean Enlightenment dream? Or does America have a real continuity with these earlier traditions and earlier sort of ways of life and modes of faith? I should say a few words about the 19th century. So having covered, kind of conservative interpretations of the American Revolution and the nature of the revolution itself, which, as I say, I don't want to discount the value of ideas, the importance of John Locke, the importance of the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson and other thinkers that were highly influential on the founders, such as Montesquieu or David Hume. I also think we have to take account of the specific historical circumstances of the American Revolution and the historical traditions that the American revolutionaries saw themselves as living out and embodying and playing within the world. That is, sort of the worldview that the Whigs of the 18th century had come to adopt. It survives into the 19th century, but it's also a story that is very simplistic and that tends to neglect the finer points of history. Jonathan Clark is very important because he talks about the other side. He talks about, well, what if, in fact, there is a strong case to be made for the English monarchy, for example, as against Parliament? What if there is a strong case to be made for the importance of religion in British politics, in American politics as well? So Jonathan Clark, he often goes by the initials JCD Clark, is someone I strongly recommend looking at as an antidote to the idea that America and indeed Britain are sort of just reflections of intellectual debates among, sort of secular Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke. J.C.D. Clark's work is very important because it shows the deeply religious and indeed denominational nature of political conflicts in early modern Britain and in the United States. Denomination is important because you not only see an ongoing, Anglo-American concern about, Catholicism, starting with, of course, Henry VIII taking the Church of England away from the Catholic Communion. But also within Protestantism itself, you see many competing strains, and they often lead to very different kinds of political outcomes. So, think of the Puritans. When the Puritans, gained control of England during the Civil War, they abolish Christmas because they think Christmas is, even then, even in the 17th century, not sufficiently Christian. They think it's, this kind of papist, party and just something that needs to be, got rid of so that we can go back to the sort of old-fashioned, supposedly original Christianity. The Puritans, they shut down the Jacobean theater, so no more Shakespeare. And in general, they conduct themselves as great hardliners. But you also have, within the victorious Protestant side of the English Civil War in the 17th century, a number of more latitudinarian thinkers. And someone like John Milton, for example, who becomes, in many ways an icon of free speech and of freedom of conscience, those are elements, too, within Protestantism, both in the English tradition and also in the American tradition. So the tendency to think of what we have inherited as simply a matter of enlightenment or not enlightenment is quite false. You really have to get into the details of Protestant thinking, of different varieties of Catholic thinking as well, which also has, a sort of mansion of many chambers. If you want to fully understand, sort of the backdrop to later politics, and especially later conservative thought. Because later progressive thought, later left-wing thought is often willing to say, hey, we don't care whatever all those old guys said, 300 or 400 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Doesn't matter, we have the right way of looking at things now. We understand the right side of history, and so just forget about the past. The past is just full of, sort of white male patriarchalists who are oppressing everyone. That's a left-wing way of looking at the world. But if you're conservative, you don't have that. You have the sense that, in fact, there is something tremendously worthwhile to be rediscovered about the intellectual traditions of the past, and that we should be in a relationship of piety towards our patrimony and towards what we have inherited. But that means you have to also look very closely and see the details and the differences in these different threads that we have, been the offspring of and the inheritors of. In the 19th century, there is a tremendous intellectual vogue for utilitarianism. Utilitarianism just says, and this is, one form of utilitarianism, but it does really kind of stand for all of the forms, that what matters in statecraft, what matters, what is the nature of justice, is the greatest good for the greatest number. And there's a tendency in utilitarianism to understand this in material terms, that, it can be the amount of money, the amount of, how much nutrition there is. One of the tendencies in utilitarianism is to start counting things. And in some ways, the field of economics is a deep elaboration of utilitarian intuitions. And you'll see that, sort of many of the world's most famous economists, including some of the most noted libertarians like Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises, they are, in fact, quite happy to tell you that they are utilitarians. Well, utilitarianism becomes, sort of conventional wisdom in the 19th century. And the older belief that you found, in someone like John Locke in natural rights tends to fade over time. So there isn't a new American edition of John Locke's Second Treatise, for example, throughout the 19th century. Another book that also gets neglected in the 19th century, Democracy in America. It's published in the 19th century, in the early part of the century, but then there isn't a new edition until the 20th century, after it first circulates in America. There really isn't as much interest in political theory in the 19th century as would later be in the 20th and has continued to be in the 21st. Instead, the ideas that are regnant in the 19th century are, again, utilitarianism. Soon you have, Darwinism and the idea of evolution in biology, which in many ways is kind of a reflection of utilitarianism, of this idea of adaptation for greater advantage. And it's the advantage of the species, of course, that matters most, not the advantage of the individual. Utilitarianism says exactly the same thing, the greatest good for the greatest number. You also have a tremendous sense of progress in the 19th century. You're seeing new technology develop. You're seeing constantly faster and faster modes of transportation. You have the steamship developed. Then you have railways. Ultimately, at the end of the century, you get into not just automobiles, but you also have the groundwork in the early 20th century for aircraft. It's a revolutionary technological century, the 19th century. And so people have this sense of progress, and they start to have this kind of left-wing tendency, especially in America, to believe that, the past is just not all that important. What's important is that America keep growing, keep moving forward, and that all of our numbers, keep improving. So, they weren't yet talking about GDP in the 19th century, but certainly the mentality which says that GDP is the indicator of the health of the entire nation was already very much present in the 19th century American spirit. So America in the 19th century, at its worst, and I shouldn't say that all of it is, kind of that reductionist or that bad, but at its worst, it does have that sort of Philistine quality, that it is not concerned about ideas. It's, people do go to church, of course, but even in church, they are often thinking of it in social utilitarian terms rather than in seriously spiritual terms. And this is, this causes people in the 19th century to say, well, will America ever have great art? Will America ever have great literature? Because the people who are just concerned with numbers and with commerce and with, continual growth, they don't seem to be thinking about the sort of tragic side of life. And they don't seem to be thinking about the sort of deeper and more spiritual side of American life. And in fact, you do find that America's greatest novelists, people like Melville and Hawthorne, they do, in fact, understand that there's more to life than utility. But the tendency throughout the century is, utilitarian, and that's true in Britain as well as in the United States. So as we get to the 20th century, you begin to have a conservative reaction against this kind of narrow utilitarian thought. There are instances I could mention from the 19th century in Britain, such as the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's a very important conservative thinker, an interesting kind of mix of Hegel and Plato and sort of thoughts of his own. But in America, you start to have an early 20th century conservatism, which is looking for life outside of mere commercial society. And this kind of conservatism takes several forms. There's a book called The Superfluous Men, published by ISI Books and edited by Robert Crunden, which brings together several different strains of early 20th century conservatism. So we're talking about basically the period from 1900 to 1945. What are some of these strains of thought? Well, if we start around 1900 and in the first decade of the 20th century, we have literary pessimists such as Henry Adams. His great book, The Education of Henry Adams, is an expression of that. Henry Adams's brother Brooks Adams is, in fact, even more downbeat and depressing in some ways than Henry Adams is. He talks about sort of the law of entropy applying to civilizations, and the idea that Western civilization, and America in particular, may be breaking down already at the early 20th century. But these are both beautiful literary writers, Henry Adams in particular. You also have a thinker by the name of Irving Babbitt, who is a professor at Harvard University, who attempts to recover the human spirit from this world of commerce and of emphasis on numbers and on science. And so Babbitt becomes the philosopher of a movement called New Humanism, which is a very sort of literary focused movement, but it has certain political corollaries as well, and it's quite conservative in its tendency. One of Babbitt's students is T.S. Eliot. And even though T.S. Eliot winds up rejecting most of Babbitt's ideas, Eliot also is a representative of a conservative reaction against the kind of Philistinism and utilitarianism and materialism of 19th century American life. So in the 20th century, this is one reason why you find Eliot attracted to the idea of a avant-garde, why he writes a poem like The Wasteland that is as revolutionary and is a total break with the very conventional sort of bourgeois American poetry of the 19th century. But Eliot is reacting against that 19th century spirit in a way that is actually quite deeply and profoundly conservative. And in some ways, Eliot might even be comfortable with a label like reactionary. And of course, Eliot, ultimately moves to Britain and considers himself, a royalist in politics, an Anglo-Catholic in religion. He's someone who rejects the whole spirit of the 19th century and becomes quite what we would call a Tory. But you have other surviving elements of conservatism in America in the early 20th century that also reject the 19th century materialist and utilitarian ethos. In the South, for example, the South has a unique historical experience because it loses the Civil War. And losing the Civil War basically means that the South has a sense of the tragic side of human life that the industrial North tends not to possess. And so you see a school of Southern agrarians and poets that arises and in the early part of the 20th century, has brilliant insights into literature. And indeed, we find that, some of the greatest American authors of the 20th century, people like William Faulkner, for example, will be coming out of the South. So the Southern agrarians are another, manifestation of conservatism in America before World War II. You also have a set of ideas called distributism, which is popularized or really pioneered by G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc in the UK. Distributism is kind of a third way between socialism and capitalism. Its emphasis is on the idea of people owning productive property in sort of widely distributed and, sort of personal amounts, right? So it may be that you have a farm of your own, but it may also mean that you own a shop of your own or a sort of small craftsman, a workshop. Distributism is trying to say that we don't want to have either the gigantism of what is already, sort of the, trust era capitalism, of U.S. Steel and these other, sort of vast conglomerates in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But we also don't want to have the kind of socialism, the destruction of, all private property that the Marxists and other radicals were championing already in the 19th century and the early 20th century. You have as well a set of what might be called elitist individualists, elitist literary individualists in the early part of the 20th century. These include figures such as H.L. Mencken and Albert J. Nock. Albert J. Nock writes a book called The Memoirs of a Superfluous Man. H.L. Mencken is, one of the most famous journalists in America in the 1920s and 1930s. And these are thinkers who, in many respects, resemble later libertarians, except they're much more concerned about sort of human excellence, and they're much more concerned about literature and philosophy than they are about economics. The libertarianism of the post-war era tends to be, sort of primarily following the lead of economic thought, whereas the elitist individualists of the early part of the 20th century, they were, concerned to kind of preserve a sense of the aristocratic individual. And of course, you no longer had aristocracy, certainly not in America, but, even throughout the world in the 20th century, it was being uprooted and destroyed by war after war. And the aristocratic ethos was what thinkers like Mencken and Albert J. Nock were trying to preserve. You can see a lot of that, by the way, is there's a premonition of it in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Tocqueville was very concerned, as a French aristocrat himself, about the loss of the aristocratic spirit and the aristocratic independence from the mob that, had characterized the old nobility. So the question becomes, in an America that is a mass society, that is a democracy, that is all about numbers and all about, accumulation of material goods, can you still have a spirit of the sort of lone individual standing against the crowd in that kind of setting? And you find a number of, quite conservative thinkers like Mencken and Nock who say that in order to do that, you have to have this great struggle against the masses. And in fact, the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset publishes a book called The Revolt of the Masses, basically talking about, how numbers in democracy and in, commercial society are starting to become oppressive to the very spirit of the human being, of the individual person. So the early 20th century is actually quite an interesting time for conservative thought, but it's all basically kind of overshadowed by a number of other things, by the persisting spirit of the 19th century, of materialism, of, the degraded liberalism of just, utilitarianism and the greatest good for the greatest number. You also have, socialism making more and more inroads into the American academy and into American government, as well as various ideas of, grandiose progress in history, some of which are derived from the German philosopher Hegel. These are the ideas that animate people like Woodrow Wilson. To some extent, they're also the ideas that animate a Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt is an interesting case because he is certainly a progressive, and in 1912 he runs as the Progressive Party's nominee for president. But Theodore Roosevelt also is a man connected enough with realities that he evinces certain conservative tendencies as well. And so many conservatives today look back at Theodore Roosevelt with a certain amount of admiration, partly for his trust busting, partly for his idea of breaking up some of these large, economic concentrations. But primarily, I think a lot of conservatives today admire Theodore Roosevelt for his conservationism, for his understanding of the importance of preserving the natural world, and also for the fact that Theodore Roosevelt was someone who believed very robustly in the traditional family, and the traditional large family at that. And this is something that I think a senator like Josh Hawley, for example, takes inspiration from. I should really say that, if you look back at early 20th century, you'll find that the connections between progressivism and conservatism are more complicated than you might imagine. There certainly is a opposition between conservatism and progressivism, but there's also a certain amount of overlap as well in a figure like Theodore Roosevelt or Robert M. La Follette or a number of others. You also often find that a number of people who start out as progressives become disillusioned with progressivism's tendency towards utopian thinking over time, and then they wind up becoming quite conservative in the end. Well, the optimism of the 19th century, this idea that human civilization all around the world is on a continual upward trajectory, that things are getting better in every way, in every place, Human beings are going to get richer and richer. Many of you will remember this kind of mentality from the end of the 20th century, that this is what people were thinking in 1999 as well as in 1899. There was just this idea that, technology and economics and, sort of administrative science, all of these things would make life infinitely better in an arc stretching on to infinity. And World War I basically shatters that dream. And then in the aftermath of World War I, what happens? You find totalitarianism taking root in many parts of the world. You have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union. You also have a very aggressive Bolshevism in Weimar Germany. And while Weimar Germany, crushes Bolshevism there, that winds up strengthening right-wing, extremists who wind up leading ultimately to the rise of the Nazi Party and the conversion of Germany into Nazi Germany. So totalitarianism was on the rise in the middle part of the 20th century, early to mid part of the century, basically 1930s, 1940s. And what this does is that a number of American intellectuals in the academy, in the media, and in government, they start to reformulate, liberalism. They start to say, well, wait a minute, if the communists, if the Bolsheviks have Karl Marx, and if they have this intellectual tradition, derived from all of these, German and other thinkers, and if, fascism is also making certain claims to being, the philosophy of the future, and that it has, Giovanni Gentili and other thinkers associated with it, then liberalism needs to be formulated in a way that is just as authoritative and that is able to counteract these kinds of totalitarian movements. So what happens is you start to have a consensus forming in the American Academy, which says that liberalism, in fact, is not something that started in the 19th century, when you first had political parties that called themselves liberal, and when liberalism was identified with causes like free trade and with sort of getting rid of many trade restrictions and high taxes, they say no. Actually, liberalism is two things. First of all, it has an earlier phase that is identified with John Locke and with Voltaire and a number of Enlightenment thinkers. And then second, liberalism is also just kind of an ongoing and growing spirit, something that applies in New Deal America as well as in relatively laissez-faire 19th century Britain. And so you have a number of intellectuals in the press and in the academy who basically say liberalism is the foundation of America. Liberalism is even the foundation of modern Western civilization. They retroactively go back. They emphasize the importance of thinkers like John Locke. They emphasize the importance of the Enlightenment. They adopt parts of the Whig theory of history, saying that there is this ongoing progressive tendency. And they say, so here we have a philosopher in the form of John Locke, who is our counterpart to Karl Marx. And this gives liberalism an intellectual respectability. It gives it a very deep heritage going back, not just to the 19th century, but to the 18th and 17th centuries. And that all of the modern world and everything we like about it is the legacy of liberalism. Well, this is an act of historical reinvention. It is anachronistic. And it's very funny because today, if you read histories of liberalism, you'll see that the first couple of pages often acknowledge this, that it really is a rank anachronism to talk about liberalism before the 19th century, before people actually labeled themselves as liberals. And yet, the very same books that will acknowledge this will then go on to say, well, but we're just going to hand-wave this away and pretend as if liberalism, in fact, is this fundamental thing that's been with us for such a very long time. Well, with liberals who control the academy and have, a prominent role in the press, saying that liberalism is foundational to Western civilization, and then when you have thinkers like Leo Strauss, who say the same thing, but for very different reasons, what you wind up with is this very broad consensus, both on the center left and stretching all the way into parts of the American right, that says, well, okay, so liberalism really is the foundation of America. It's perhaps the foundation of all of modernity and all of modern civilization. And, if you criticize liberalism, you're therefore criticizing America, and you're criticizing everything that's good about modern life. And also, of course, if you are criticizing liberalism, that means you are illiberal. And that means that, you are basically on the same side of history as the communists, the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, the fascists. Now, this is an insane way to do intellectual history. This is basically pure partisanship, but it's partisanship among high intellectuals as opposed to partisanship among people, just voting for the local city councilman. It's a partisanship which basically says all that is good and right is on our side, and this extends back, as far as we choose to take it, and that anyone who disagrees with us is inherently a bad person. If you're not a liberal, you are an illiberal, and if you're an illiberal, that means your ideas are a cousin to all of these totalitarian ideas of the middle 20th century. Now, serious intellectual historians, and this includes Leo Strauss, don't really present, that kind of simplistic view. Leo Strauss, as I say, is a subtle thinker. You have to read him very carefully to figure out exactly the point that he's getting across. And while, Strauss certainly does have criticisms of modernity, he is not at all saying that America is, identical with everything that has been called liberalism, or that liberalism is the only tradition that America should regard seriously. In fact, one of the great themes of Leo Strauss's work is that Americans need to rediscover the classical world and classical philosophy and Plato and Aristotle. And that basically, I think one of the valid interpretations that people have of Leo Strauss is that, American liberalism is rather weak. And American liberalism will collapse in on itself if it is not strengthened by something beyond liberalism. And the classical tradition is the tradition towards which Leo Strauss points. So in the early post-war era, you have this, sort of great liberal consensus forming. And a thinker at Harvard University by the name of Louis Hartz publishes a book called The Liberal, I'm going to get the title slightly wrong here, but it's basically the liberal tradition in America. And he says that, America has only had a liberal tradition from the very beginning, that, if you want to look for conservatism, you have to look at Europe, you have to look at sort of traditional aristocratic societies and agrarian societies, because America doesn't have that background, therefore America doesn't have an authentically American conservatism. Well, this is precisely what people like Russell Kirk are rejecting and objecting to in publishing a book like The Conservative Mind in 1953. But there is this, tremendous amount of argument among different conservatives in the post-war era as to precisely what conservatism is all about. So someone like Robert Nisbet looks back to Alexis de Tocqueville as perhaps the leading light of conservative thought in the modern world. Russell Kirk looks back to Edmund Burke in 18th century British politics. Leo Strauss, again, is looking back to the classical tradition, to Plato and Aristotle in particular. And you have, in the post-war era, a situation which is reflected in George H. Nash's great book, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. Nash there traces three components of post-war conservatism. And I'll briefly mention them in summary. There's libertarianism, much of it reflected by emigres who have come to America fleeing from Nazi tyranny. This is people like Friedrich Hayek, for example. And they bring with them ideas of individual liberty as a system that is integrated with free market economics. So think of Hayek's Road to Serfdom or Constitution of Liberty as key examples of this libertarian strain in post-war American conservative thought. Then you have the people that George Nash calls the traditionalists. And this is a more heterodox category. It includes people like Russell Kirk. It also includes Robert Nisbet. It includes a number of thinkers who have begun to rediscover in the post-war era the natural law tradition, a number of thinkers who have begun to reflect on Thomas Aquinas and other great Catholic thinkers. And so traditionalism is, sort of defined by the fact that it doesn't, as the libertarians do, make liberty and economics its primary concerns, but rather is instead looking to religion, looking to society, even to sociology, looking to literature. This is what you find in people like Robert Nisbet, Russell Kirk, and Richard Weaver. And then a third great strain in post-war American conservative thought is anti-communism, especially from ex-communists. And this is reflected in a book like Witness by Whittaker Chambers. It's reflected in many of the books by James Burnham, who is another early contributor to National Review. And Burnham is offering strategies that are, designed to defeat communism, not just to create a coexistence between the free world and communism, but actually to defeat communism over time, which does not necessarily mean World War III and direct military conflict. One of Burnham's great books is called Containment or Liberation, for example, where he's challenging this George Kennan idea of containment. So the post-war intellectual conservative movement has these threads. It has anti-communism, traditionalism, libertarianism, and a man by the name of Frank Meyer, who's a senior editor at National Review magazine, tries to bring these threads together and synthesize them into a consistent philosophy, which he calls fusionism. In fact, it's actually his opponents that call it fusionism, but Frank Meyer, as many folks wind up doing, simply accepts the label that his opponents have given him and turns it around and says, okay, if you want to call it fusionism, we'll call it fusionism, but here's what the idea stands for. And Meyer's idea was that, in fact, these competing libertarian and traditionalist strains of American conservatism in the post-war era had originally been one consistent thread. And it broke apart in the 19th century as a result of some of the 19th century intellectual tendencies that I've discussed earlier. And so there was a need to bring these two threads back together, and that is to, involves both limiting government and adopting some libertarian views of economics and of the sort of limits on the power of the state. But it also recognizes that human beings have moral ends and spiritual ends, and that is the traditionalist component of fusionism. Well, fusionism is in some ways the de facto philosophy of Barry Goldwater and of the American conservative movement as a whole from roughly maybe not 1945, but somewhere around 1955 or so, and 1964, 1965, basically until the Nixon era begins in 1969. And this kind of conservatism, fusionism, will later on become strongly identified with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And then going on into the 1990s and 2000s, you'll often find conservative institutions saying, well, fusionism, that just is conservatism. In fact, sometimes they even go farther and say, well, American conservatism is really just classical liberalism. And when they say that, they're reflecting the tremendous influence of, the academics and journalists who in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s tried to create this idea of a grand liberalism that was the foundation both for America and of modern Western civilization. That gets sort of rolled in with this fusionist idea, even though Frank Meyer himself was always very careful not to do that. Frank Meyer did not generally identify himself as a liberal. He did not say that American conservatism was just liberalism. He actually said that, classical liberalism was one component, but it was actually kind of a heresy. It was actually kind of a deviation from this combined fusionist idea of both traditionalism and, libertarianism together. Classical liberalism was just one side of that, and Meyer really did believe that you needed both. But between the era of Barry Goldwater and the era of Ronald Reagan, you have the era of Richard Nixon. And this is a time in which America is undergoing tremendous amounts of upheaval. You have the Vietnam War, you have the Civil Rights Movement, you have, an expanding sense of feminism. You have, even things like the gay rights movement are getting started in the 1960s and the 1970s. It is a cultural revolution in America at the same time as you have tremendous revolutionary forces being unleashed all around the world. It's a time when many Americans are admiring, people like not just Che Guevara, but even Mao Zedong. It's a time when the British Empire is, coming to its very end, and you start to have these movements of national liberation, not just in Africa, but also, in East Asia and elsewhere. It's a time of tremendous revolutionary upheaval. And so the question of what conservatism means becomes extremely salient, even in America, because you have, violence in the streets, you have riots in the cities, you have a war that is not going well in Vietnam. And you have these very questions about what America stands for and what it is. And you see two different things come together to form a new kind of conservatism during the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and throughout the 1970s, really. One strain is actually an influx of what come to be called the neoconservatives. And the neoconservatives are former Cold War liberals. They have been people who were attached to the Democratic Party. In some cases, they were even, sort of admirers of Leon Trotsky, who, of course, was an early Bolshevik who loses a power struggle with Stalin. And I was always kind of puzzled by this. How is it that you go from Leon Trotsky to becoming a neoconservative and, sort of becoming part of the Republican Party and advising Ronald Reagan and stuff like that? It just seems like a very strange trajectory. And I finally, read a couple of books that, sort of clarified it for me. The key thing was that in the early part of the Cold War, the people you could most count upon to hate Joseph Stalin and to hate the Soviet Union were the people who were the rivals for Stalinism, right? So just as you often see within religion or within political parties, the strongest animosities are between the people who otherwise might seem closest together, but they're both competing for that same defining role. In socialism, in Marxism, in communism, the Trotskyists were the people you could count on to hate Joseph Stalin the absolute most. And, of course, they understood communism. They understood the communist mentality. So this made Trotskyists actually very valuable to the CIA and to a number of other American institutions that wanted to have people who were devoted to opposing Stalin, opposing the Soviet Union, but who also understood where communism was coming from. And during the early part of the Cold War era, these people were comfortable in the Democratic Party. But in the late 1960s and 1970s, the Democratic Party is starting to become, if not pro-Soviet, it certainly is becoming in favor of various third world revolutions. And there are tensions between, the Jewish members of the Democratic Party's coalition and the black members of the Democratic Party's coalition, especially over questions of Israel. Is Israel a colonial settler state, as many leftists today say? Is Israel instead, the necessary response of an oppressed people to the oppression they've suffered? This becomes a, tremendously controversial issue within the Democratic Party. And you have a number of radicals, the Black Panthers and others, who are very strongly anti-Israel. So if you are a center-left Jewish person, and you are supporting the Cold War, and you're also supporting Israel, and you look at the tendency of the Democratic Party in the late 1960s, you start to say, this is not my party anymore. This is now a party that is embracing a kind of third world radicalism against Israel, and ultimately against the United States as well, because you have radicals in the Democratic Party who, in many respects, they're not anti-war, really. They're actually just on the other side. They are rooting for the Viet Cong. They're rooting for the communist Vietnamese against the America in Vietnam. So the neoconservatives, they were happy to be Lyndon Johnson or, JFK liberal Democrats. But in the, environment of the late 1960s and 1970s, they wind up saying the Democratic Party is just not for us anymore. Also, the Democratic Party, because identity politics gets started in this era. And you have, again, quite hardline feminism. You have, the beginning of the gay liberation movement and all these other things. A lot of these, just more traditional types of people who were neoconservatives wind up saying the Democratic Party is becoming a madhouse. I don't belong here. I'm now going to go to the Republican Party. And these are a number of intellectuals, such as most notably Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz. Commentary Magazine is kind of the primary outlet for the neoconservative thought at this point in time. Neoconservatives are also, because of their background, with social science, and their background as Democrats who are now very alienated from the Democratic Party, they're also very concerned about crime. And some of the best criminological work that is done in the 60s and 70s and 80s is done by neoconservatives like James Q. Wilson, for example. So neoconservatives come to the conservative movement. They come into the Republican Party. There is, however, a bit of a problem, because the neoconservatives had never been Goldwaterites. They had never been traditionalists of the Russell Kirk variety. They had never been, hardline libertarians like a Ludwig von Mises or a Murray Rothbard. And the neoconservatives, they still have the sense that the center left is maybe the most pragmatic part of American politics. So what they wind up doing is in some ways redefining the center right as being like the old center left of the period before the Democratic Party went insane. So the Democratic Party of JFK and of Harry Truman is the kind of political ideal that the neoconservatives often still have, even when they become Republicans, even when they become part of the conservative movement. This causes a lot of friction, will cause a lot of friction in the Ronald Reagan era. Because when it comes time for the Reagan administration to make appointments, neoconservatives are often saying, here's our candidate, and traditional conservatives or paleoconservatives are saying, here's our candidate, a different person. And they have different ideas about what's pragmatic, different ideas about what's acceptable in terms of intellectual background and training and so forth. You get these very bitter struggles, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. The other development in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and really throughout the 1970s, is the rise of a populist conservatism. And Nixon gives voice to this with the phrase silent majority. It is the idea that, most Americans just want to, raise their families. They want to have an honest day's wage for an honest day's work. They don't want to get involved in these culture war, left-wing revolutionary issues. They are patriotic. They love America. They want America to win overseas. They don't want to see us, humiliated in Vietnam. They don't want to see violence in the streets. They want crime to be brought under control. They're just normal people. But in the environment of the 1960s, already the American Academy and American journalism are starting to become very left-wing in their outlook. And that means the silent Americans, the silent majority, has no voice. And this is something that a number of new conservative institutions come into existence in order to embody. So in the late 1970s, for example, you have a movement of Christians to create the moral majority. And the moral majority is meant to represent, many Christian views that back in the 1950s were basically almost everywhere. But in the 1970s, we're already under attack. The idea that, the natural family, the, nuclear family is superior to a, sort of postmodern family of, different, parents of the same gender and, children who, might be changing gender and all that. Surprisingly enough, a lot of this stuff gets started already as early as the 1970s, and school boards are already a major component of this. And that's why things like the moral majority and later the Christian coalition get started. You also have, a new amount of conservative activism in creating policy institutions. So the Heritage Foundation is created in the late 1970s as an embodiment of this. You have single-issue groups focusing on things like Second Amendment rights and on things like, tax reduction and tax limitation. The 1970s is sort of a great era of proliferation of these different conservative institutions. And there are certain thinkers who develop a theory of the new right-wing populism. One of the most important of these is a man by the name of Kevin Phillips, who writes a book called The Emerging Republican Majority. And Phillips becomes an advisor to Richard Nixon. And Phillips winds up becoming quite critical of the earlier conservatism. He looks at, the conservatism of the William F. Buckley Jr. era in the 50s and 60s and says, what does this have to do with ordinary working class Americans' concerns? Here you have these, overeducated types, some of whom are European intellectuals who've emigrated to the United States. Why are they the ones defining American conservatism rather than Americans who actually understand their own precincts, their own localities, their own traditions? So Kevin Phillips and a number of other populist thinkers in the 1970s, they start calling themselves the new right in the 1970s. They're actually very critical of the right that had been, embodied by Fusionism and by National Review and by Barry Goldwater. Well, Ronald Reagan, his great success is that he brings these different threads together. Neoconservatives support Ronald Reagan, populists support Ronald Reagan very strongly, and the traditional conservative movement, the Goldwaterite and National Review components of conservatism, they all support Ronald Reagan. So this looks like a great triumph when Ronald Reagan wins the White House in 1980. It looks like all conservatives will come together and you'll have a consensus. But that's not what happens. And in fact, the Reagan administration winds up being a battleground for these different schools of thought among conservatives during the 1980s. I won't get into some of the details. They're interesting, but they are sort of, extensive enough that they should be kept for another time. But the main thing that develops is an ongoing feud between what are called paleoconservatives and the new neoconservatives. Now, the paleoconservatives are actually not just the old traditionalists, although some of them are, in fact, some of the same people as were the old traditionalists that George H. Nash talks about. But the paleoconservatives are really best understood as a mixture of the old traditionalists of the 1950s, who are often, coming from an explicitly Christian point of view, who are often, very critical of social science in general and of economics in particular, and who have, the idea that we need to really save small-town America and to save an America that is good for, families and local environments. That kind of traditionalism from the 1950s, plus the kind of populist insurgent spirit of the late 1970s. That's what creates paleoconservatism, and it's embodied by a figure like Pat Buchanan in politics. In the intellectual world, it's embodied by a magazine called Chronicles, which is published for a very long time in Rockford, Illinois, and it includes thinkers like Sam Francis and Paul Gottfried and many others. The paleoconservatives wind up having pretty sharp elbows, and they are rhetorically sort of bomb throwers, which they have to be, because the neoconservatives are very effective at working within conservative institutions, including the philanthropic and foundation world, so that neoconservatives wind up being, heavily advantaged, heavily, in some ways in charge of many conservative institutions. The paleoconservatives feel excluded, and so the paleoconservatives start being very critical of and attacking in many ways conservative institutions of all kinds. And even to this day, you'll find, people like Paul Gottfried, for example, are often considered quite disagreeable and fractious. Well, that has a history, in part, from these very bruising battles that were fought in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, from the end of the 1980s into the George W. Bush years, the neoconservatives tend to have a dominant role within American conservatism. It doesn't mean they're the only ones. You still have traditionalists, you still have libertarians, you still have a number of others. But the neoconservatives are seen as being pragmatic, they're seen as being modern, they're seen as being people who the New York Times is happy to feature on its editorial page. Whereas, if you're an old-fashioned Kirkian or a radical libertarian like Murray Rothbard, you might be considered, perhaps uncouth or perhaps just kind of archaic and old-fashioned and, sort of not contemporary enough to be relevant. And, in the 2000s, you start to have a sort of modified mixture of neoconservatism and Christian conservatism called compassionate conservatism. And this is the label that George W. Bush adopts for himself and for his philosophy of government. And compassionate conservatism it makes peace with the welfare state in some respects. Bush gives you Medicare Part D, an expansion of the Medicare program. Bush wants to be an education president. He works with the Democratic Senator Teddy Kennedy to try to expand the Department of Education. And in general, the tendency of, the combination of neoconservatism and compassionate conservatism is to say that, we don't need this libertarian concern about small government, but we also perhaps don't need these, sort of populist concerns about immigration and trade, because free trade and immigration are actually good for economic growth, and economic growth lifts all boats. So you wind up with a form of conservatism in the 2000s, which owes a great debt to certain parts of classical liberalism, but that isn't actually libertarian, and that, is willing to countenance a very large growth in government. And this causes all sorts of unhappiness with people like my friend Don Devine, for example, who's at the Fund for American Studies. A number of old fusionists say this is the total negation of the Reagan philosophy. Having, this big government George W. Bush guy in charge in Washington, Reagan would be rolling over in his grave. And then, of course, you have the Iraq War. 9/11 happens. The Bush administration says it's not enough simply to throw the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan. We need to have a war on terrorism all around the globe, but particularly in the Middle East, and in particular against the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This winds up being, very unusual. Throughout the 20th century, almost all the wars have been fought or begun under democratic administrations. That's true of Vietnam. It's true of the World Wars. At one point in the 1976 vice presidential debates, Bob Dole, the Republican vice presidential nominee, actually says a very politically incorrect thing. He refers to the wars of the 20th century as Democrat wars. And that was very controversial then, but there's an element of truth to it, which is that the Republican Party was a party of realism and restraint for the most part. Not to the extent that, sort of so-called isolationists would find acceptable. But in general, the Republican Party believed in having a strong military, but in using it sparingly. And the Reagan administration reflects this. So Reagan has a military operation in Grenada. Reagan bombs Libya. But in general, Reagan is not trying to promote, sort of regime change by actively introducing U.S. forces into, hotspots and trying to foment revolutions. The George H.W. Bush administration gets to be more activist than Reagan or Nixon had been. So you see George H.W. Bush, actively getting us into the conflict between Iraq and Kuwait in the Persian Gulf War of 1991. And then George W. Bush, after 9/11, goes much farther and decides we're actually going to have regime change and nation building within Iraq. We're going to turn Iraq from a dictatorship into a democracy. This, in some ways, is the kind of foreign policy that a progressive liberal like Woodrow Wilson had at the time of World War I and afterwards. And this, too, causes a great deal of friction with more traditional conservative thinkers. And at the time, because George W. Bush was very popular in the early 2000s, conservatives who are critical of the Iraq War are made to feel like outsiders or traitors. They really are given a cold shoulder. And in a neoconservatism, which by this point has come to be identified with a kind of democratic idealism and the promotion of democracy around the world. It continues to be the most influential philosophy within the George W. Bush administration and within a great many conservative magazines and institutions and think tanks. However, the results of the Iraq War and the results of the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, they wind up being very discrediting to this idea of conservative globalism, this idea that, we could fight every war around the world to promote democracy, this idea that, free trade would always be greatly beneficial to Americans all, at all social levels, and this idea that unlimited immigration would, be easily assimilated and would not cause any problems for the Republican Party or for conservative thought in general. Instead, there is a backlash that begins, at the very end of the George W. Bush years, and then starts to carry over time. Basically, it is the crack up, the collapse of the neoconservative consensus that had formed, a decade or two before. And then you start to find these new shoots coming out, these kinds of new manifestations, in some cases of old philosophies, and in some cases new formulations of, strains of thought that had not existed on the right before. That leads us into today, where you see someone like Donald Trump, who represents a kind of instinctive populist conservatism. Now, there are arguments about, precisely how populist his policies may be, but certainly Donald Trump, reflects the populist attitude that the elites have messed up the country and need to be replaced. And many of the themes that, Donald Trump made central to his campaign in 2016 were identical to themes that Pat Buchanan had been talking about in the early 1990s, in 1992, and in 1996. So there's a lot of revived interest now in paleoconservatism, not just in the thought of Pat Buchanan, but in the thought of, interesting, hard to describe thinkers, someone like Michael Lind, for example, who despite being, generally someone who would self-identify as more of a liberal or someone who's more on the democratic side of things, nonetheless is a great Hamiltonian, a great defender of the idea that America needs an industrial policy. You see a lot of, thinkers, including Orrin Cass and F.H. Buckley, who say that conservatism needs to be more pro-family, conservatism needs to be more pro-worker, that it needs to, see the transformation of the Republicans into a kind of workers' party, and that this new economic agenda is different from the older libertarian economic agenda that had characterized, most of conservatism in the fusionist era. And it's also different from the kind of globalist economic agenda that had characterized conservatism in the George W. Bush era and during the hegemony of neoconservatism. You also find that there is increasing unhappiness on the right with the kind of compromise that many more pragmatic neoconservatives and compassionate conservatives had made with the march of social leftism and progressivism in American life. So especially after the Obergefell decision, which nationalized same-sex marriage, you see the rise of, increasingly strong conservative religious counter-movements. And these have also, taken a look at, transgenderism, taken a look at, the fact that now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned, there is a chance to have real restrictions upon abortion or bans on abortion outright. So there is a revival of a kind of social conservatism, but it's not just the old, ecumenical social conservatism that you saw in the 1970s and 1980s. Instead, you often have a very intensely denominational kind of conservative philosophical thought among different varieties of Christians. So you see, for example, integralism among Catholic thinkers, such as Adrian Vermeule, and you see a Christian nationalism among, a variety of Protestant thinkers. You also have the rise of something called national conservatism that has been championed by Yoram Hazony, who is an Israeli-American thinker. He lives in Jerusalem, but he is very concerned about nationalism all around the world, especially in America, because the nation-state is, of course, central to the existence of Israel. There's a great insight in the final chapter of Yoram Hazony's book on nationalism, where he talks about how after World War II, there were two responses to the idea that World War II was a kind of, nationalist, massacre and tragedy. One was the European Union response, which is to say, we kind of need to get rid of nation states. We need to have just these, transnational administrative apparatuses, and the European Union will be the great test market for that. And then you have the Israeli response, which says, wait a minute, if you are people who are being oppressed because you are just a minority in sort of other countries all around the world. Maybe you need to have a country of your own. The principle of the nation state is still correct, and that's why the state of Israel needs to exist. And there is a clash between this European, and of course it's also a school of thought you find among many Americans, a clash between a school of thought which says nationalism is always bad, nation states are always bad and should be transcended, and that includes Israel, which the left calls a colonial settler state. So nation states of all kinds must be transcended and dismantled. And on the other hand, the idea that actually, the Jewish experience proves why you need to have nationalism. And so, and to defend, the state of Israel, you also need to have strong nationalist movements in other parts of the world, especially in America. America as a nation state, American patriotism, American industrial might that was based upon, a series of tariffs and industrial policies throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. These are the very sinews, the very muscles that made America capable of winning the two world wars and of the Cold War as well. If you get rid of the idea that nations should put their own citizens first and their own interests first, then you wind up with a globalized economy that, in fact, those few states that still have a strong sense of destiny, perhaps the People's Republic of China, might take advantage of and use to advance their own power. So conservatism today is a very, I think very fascinating and encouraging intellectual battleground between all of these different threads. Certainly the threads that have emerged, since the wreckage of the neoconservative hegemony era. But also you do find, survivors of the neoconservative era who still cling to their old philosophy. Many of them, interestingly enough, have migrated back to the Democratic Party of, their fathers. I could name some names here, but it's probably unnecessary that I do so. You still have libertarians who have their institutions, although there is a crisis right now in libertarianism because, as economic questions in some ways give way to questions of culture, libertarians find themselves at a bit of a crossroads because libertarians always said, well, we will let economics and, the sort of non-aggression principle just guide us. But it turns out you actually do have to decide what kind of culture you want to live in. A culture that has roots in, sort of classical civilization, Western civilization, Christianity, Judaism, etc., or a, culture that has its roots in a, sort of rejection of all those things and the idea that we can do better now because we understand how to be more sensitive, how to be more feminist, how to be more welcoming of all the marginalized populations and of people who may have, exotic sexual desires. If you're a libertarian, you can say, well, I want low taxes. Fine. You can get low taxes under, any kind of, political system, perhaps. But, obviously you still have a life beyond your pocketbook. And so even libertarians are starting to ask themselves culturally which way they are going to go. And, you see some tensions in the Libertarian Party here and also in, various libertarian institutions. I will just wrap up by saying that, I want to point back to my opening remarks that we need to take history very seriously. Our history as Americans, our history as inheritors of Western civilization, and indeed our history stretching back to the classical period. And while I've criticized in some respects, the tendency of people who are inspired by Leo Strauss to think of America and think of Western civilization as all based upon Enlightenment liberalism, I want to praise Leo Strauss for telling us that we should take political theory texts very seriously, especially those that are classical. And what we need to do as a conservative is basically see out of both eyes. You need to have one eye on theory, one eye on the great books, one eye on intellectual, roots of our civilization, but also one eye on practice, one eye on tradition, as embodied by the actual lived history that we've had. And if you ignore either one of those, you'll find yourself in trouble. If you ignore the power of ideas, what winds up happening is that even if you are successful in politics or in your family life in the short term, you wind up being shocked by the way in which these insane academics are able to take over institutions and to, sort of guide the direction of the civilization in which you live and in which your grandchildren will also have to ultimately live. So ignoring the intellectual side of the battle is fatal. On the other hand, if you put all of your emphasis on the intellectual side and ignore, the sort of human historical side, what you wind up doing is oftentimes succumbing to despair or to revolutionary fanaticism. because you wind up saying, well, the world in which we live is never good enough for theory. It's never Plato's Republic. If we look at the Christian Middle Ages, we see actually, there were lots of conflicts between the papacy and the nobility. If we look at, America, we can say, well, America seemed to be a pretty faithful country, at the start, but America also had patent laws, and America had, all of these things that would create a stronger capitalism in the future. Theory tells us that all of this is going to be corrupting, and therefore, what are you left with? Well, you're left with just saying that, everything that exists is kind of bad, has to be replaced by something which you, as an intellectual who has, the knowledge, the gnosis of the correct way of doing things, that you can be entrusted with the power to remake the world for everyone. Well, that's the kind of mentality that you usually find on the left. And unfortunately, it is just as destructive when it crops up on the right. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying that everyone who thinks quite radically and thinks, sort of right down to the deepest principles is therefore vulnerable to that kind of utopian thinking. And notice that there is this weird sort of dynamic between despair and utopianism. They are flip sides of the same coin. The good conservative, the correct conservative, the right conservative is someone who not only has both a historical sense and a sense of intellect and theory, but it's also a conservative who's willing to say that making the world more humane, making the world more conformable to our Christian heritage, to our classical heritage, to what is right in nature, this is our duty in life. And it will never be perfect, but we're not aiming necessarily at perfection upon this world. It's certainly not something we will attain and sustain over time. It is a fallen world, but it is a world in which we nonetheless have a duty to do what we can and what we must. And therefore, sort of abandoning the world for the, sort of castles in the sky and for the kinds of dreams and despairs of the left is just as destructive if you call yourself a conservative as it is if you call yourself a Marxist or a cultural Marxist or a progressive or whatever the case may be. So with that, I will wrap up, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.